Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My husband confessed, "I love your sister. We have been secretly together for 5 years." I smiled and sent one 3-word message. When my sister read it, her face went pale. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." People always say you never truly know someone until something breaks. I used to think that was just something bitter people said after bad divorces. The kind of thing you nod at politely and then forget, because your own life feels solid, feels real. My life with Daniel felt real. Our house in Naperville, Illinois, with the wraparound porch and the hydrangeas I planted the first spring after we moved in. Friday night dinners where we'd open a bottle of Malbec and talk until midnight about nothing important and everything that mattered. 11 years of marriage, a joint savings account, a rescue dog named Biscuit, a shared password for the Netflix account. That's what love looks like when it's been lived in. Unremarkable, comfortable yours. My sister Rachel lived 40 minutes away in a condo in Wicker Park. She was 2 years younger than me, sharper in some ways, louder in others. We weren't always close growing up. There was competition in the ways sisters sometimes have without naming it. But as adults, we'd built something I genuinely treasured. Sunday brunches, venting phone calls, the kind of sisterhood that felt earned. She and Daniel got along well. Of course they did. I was proud of that. I used to point to it as proof that my two worlds fit together neatly. The first crack was so small I almost missed it. It was a Tuesday in October, about 14 months before everything fell apart. I came home early from work. My meeting had been canceled. And I heard Daniel's voice in the kitchen, low and warm, the particular softness he used when he didn't think anyone was listening. I assumed he was on the phone with his brother. I set my bag down in the hallway and started sorting through the mail, not paying attention. Then I heard him laugh. That specific laugh, the one he used to reserve for me in the early years, quiet and private, like a secret shared between two people in a crowded room. I walked into the kitchen. He was standing with his back to me, phone pressed to his ear. When he heard my footsteps, he turned, and something crossed his face. Not guilt, not yet, more like recalibration. A split second where he decided how to arrange his expression before settling on a smile. "Hey, you're home early," he said. "That's Rachel. She says hi." I took the phone. Rachel did say hi. We talked for 2 minutes about nothing, but I stood in my own kitchen feeling like I'd walked into a room where the furniture had been moved an inch, everything technically in place, and yet wrong. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that for months. Over the following weeks, I began noticing the pattern with the quiet, methodical dread of someone who doesn't want to find what they're looking for. Daniel started protecting his phone in ways he never had before. Screen down on the table, taken into the bathroom, charged in his home office instead of on the nightstand where it had sat for 11 years. Rachel began canceling our Sunday brunches with increasing frequency, always with reasonable excuses. A work deadline, a cold, a friend visiting from out of town. Each excuse was perfectly plausible. Together, they formed a shape I didn't want to name. I started paying attention to timing. When Daniel said he was working late, I'd text Rachel, casually about something unrelated, and notice how long it took her to reply. The delays were inconsistent in a way that felt consistent. I know how paranoid that sounds. I know how easy it is to build a case from shadows. I kept telling myself that's all it was. Then came the night that ended my ability to pretend. It was a Saturday in December. Daniel had been distant all week, polite in the way that people are when they're managing something they haven't told you. After dinner, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table, folded his hands, and looked at me with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was now discovering no rehearsal was enough. "Megan," he said, "there's something I have to tell you." I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming, biscuit asleep under the table, warm against my feet, the half-empty wine glass in my hand. "I love Rachel," he said. "I'm in love with her. We've been together for 5 years. I'm sorry, I needed you to hear it from me." 5 years. 5 years. Half a decade. While I was planting hydrangeas and opening bottles of Malbec and calling that love, they had been building something else entirely in the spaces I couldn't see. There's a specific kind of silence that descends when the thing you feared most turns out to be true. It isn't shock, exactly. It's more like the world confirming a suspicion you'd been desperately hoping was wrong. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled. And I still can't fully explain that smile, except to say it was the smile of a woman who had just decided something. I picked up my phone. I opened my messages with Rachel, and I typed 3 words. "I have proof." I hit send. Then I set the phone face down on the table, exactly the way Daniel had been doing for months, and I went to bed. When Rachel read it, Daniel told me later, her face went completely white. Good, it was supposed to. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I lay in the dark on my side of the bed. Daniel had retreated to the guest room without being asked, which told me he understood the geography of what had just happened. And I stared at the ceiling and did what I imagine every woman does in the first hours after her world rearranges itself. I made a list. Not on paper, in my head, a cold, precise accounting. 11 years of marriage. The house, purchased together 6 years ago, both names on the deed. The joint savings account with $74,000 in it. Money we'd been setting aside for a renovation we'd been planning for 2 years. The kind of plans people make when they believe they have a future. My 401k, which I had faithfully contributed to, and which, under Illinois law, accrued during the marriage, meant it was partially marital property. Daniel's business. A mid-sized landscaping company he'd started with a partner 8 years ago. Profitable. Growing. I had signed a personal guarantee on the original business loan. My name was woven into the financial fabric of his life in ways I was only now beginning to fully inventory. And Rachel. That was its own category of loss, separate and deeper than the marriage because a husband can become a stranger over time, but a sister is supposed to be something else entirely. We had shared a childhood. We had shared a bathroom and a mother's attention and the particular shorthand that only siblings have. 5 years. She had sat across from me at Sunday brunch for 5 years, listened to me talk about my marriage, offered sympathy when I mentioned Daniel and I were going through a rough patch, and said nothing. Not nothing because she didn't know, nothing because she was the reason. That's a specific kind of cruelty. It requires sustained effort. It requires looking someone in the eye and choosing repeatedly to lie. By 4 a.m, the grief had begun to crystallize into something harder. What did they expect would happen now? That I would cry, collapse, beg Daniel to stay? That I would call Rachel and scream, give them both the satisfaction of my devastation? Or worse, that I would simply accept the situation quietly, sign whatever papers were put in front of me, and disappear from my own life with the minimum of fuss. I got up at 6, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. The first thing I did was transfer half the balance of our joint savings account into my personal account, $27,000. This wasn't theft. Under Illinois law, marital assets belong to both spouses equally, and I was entitled to exactly what I took. But I did it before Daniel was awake, before he thought to do it himself because I had stopped assuming good faith. Was I scared? Absolutely. My hands were shaking when I typed in the transfer amount. Fear is honest. It tells you the stakes are real, but fear and paralysis are not the same thing, and I had made a decision somewhere between midnight and morning. I was not going to be passive in my own devastation. I called in sick to work that Monday. I needed one uninterrupted day. By 9 a.m., I had done enough research to know I needed a divorce attorney who specialized in asset-heavy marital estates. I had 3 names pulled from Illinois State Bar referrals, rated for contested divorces, and I had appointments scheduled with 2 of them by 10. The earliest was Wednesday morning. Daniel came downstairs at 8:30. He looked like a man who had also not slept. Gray-faced, careful in his movements, dressed in yesterday's clothes. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter watching me. "We should talk," he said. "We will," I said, "with lawyers present." He opened his mouth, closed it, nodded once. That was the last substantive conversation we had without attorneys in the room for the next 8 months. After he left the house, I heard him make a phone call in the driveway, hushed and urgent, and I knew exactly who he was calling. I sat back down at my laptop and opened a new document. This was where my plan began to take real shape. Daniel's landscaping business had a website, client accounts, subcontractor relationships. Over the years, he'd had me handle the bookkeeping during 2 periods when his office manager was out on leave. I still had login credentials to the accounting software. He'd never removed them. I wasn't going to touch anything. I wasn't going to interfere with his business or do anything illegal, but I was going to look because I had a feeling that a man who had been conducting a 5-year secret affair had found creative ways to fund it, and that some of those ways might be relevant to what a judge would consider when dividing assets. I also opened my email and composed a message to my closest friend, Diane, a woman I had known since college, a woman who had met Daniel at our wedding and held my hand at my father's funeral. I didn't tell her everything yet. I just said, "I need you. Can we meet this week?" She replied within 20 minutes. "I'm here. Name the place." I closed the laptop and looked out the kitchen window at my hydrangeas, dormant now under the December frost. I had planted them in my first spring here. They came back every year. I had tended them. Let them try to take the house, I thought. Let them try. The law offices of Patricia Juan were on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Chicago, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the gray December lake. I remember that detail specifically. The flatness of the water, the color of pewter, how indifferent it looked. It matched how I was trying to feel. Patricia Juana was 53, trim, precise, with the particular stillness of a person who had spent 30 years sitting across from people in crisis and had learned not to absorb their turbulence. She let me speak for 15 minutes without interrupting. Then she asked me 3 questions, took 4 pages of notes, and told me exactly what I had and what I needed. What I had: 11 years of marriage, shared real estate, shared business liability, documented joint finances, and a husband who had verbally admitted to a long-term affair. In Illinois, adultery itself doesn't determine asset division. It's a no-fault divorce state. but it can influence certain aspects of settlement negotiations, particularly if marital funds were used to conduct the affair. That last part was the one I'd been thinking about since Monday morning. "I want to look at the business finances," I told her. "I had bookkeeping access. I think he may have run personal expenses through the company." Patricia looked at me with the measured respect of someone encountering a client who has done her homework. "Don't access those accounts again without my guidance," she said. "But if you have records from when you legitimately had access, screenshots, exports, anything you saved during that period, that's a different matter." I did have records. I had been the organized one in our marriage. I had spreadsheets. She filed the initial divorce petition that week. The moment that document was stamped and served, everything became official, everything became documented, and Daniel could no longer make unilateral financial decisions without potential legal consequence. That was the point. Not to punish him, not yet, but to put walls around what was mine before he could move it. Daniel was served on a Thursday morning. I know because I was at a coffee shop 3 blocks from our house when my phone buzzed with a notification from the process server confirming delivery, and I sat there with my latte and felt something shift in my chest. Not relief exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a door closing behind you. No going back. Good. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Rachel would react. She called me that Thursday afternoon. The first direct contact since my 3-word text, 12 days earlier. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was 12 seconds long, and her voice was controlled in the way voices are when someone is trying very hard to sound calm. She said she wanted to meet. She said there were things I didn't understand. She said she was sorry. She did not sound sorry, she sounded strategic. I didn't call back. Meanwhile, I could feel them watching me. Daniel had moved into a hotel, or claimed to, though I suspected he was staying at Rachel's condo, which was an irony I noted and filed away, and he had become suddenly solicitous in a way that read as damage control. He texted me about Biscuit's vet appointment. He asked if I needed anything from the house. He was performing reasonableness for an audience he assumed was recording because I had taught him to be careful. He just didn't know how careful I'd already been. The proof I found didn't come from the business accounts. It came from a cardboard box in the back of Daniel's home office closet. I had been going through the house methodically, cataloging assets for Patricia's purposes. Furniture, artwork, appliances, anything of value that would need to be accounted for in the settlement. It was tedious, practical work, and it was in the middle of that work, on a gray Saturday afternoon, that I pulled down the box to check what was in it and found, beneath a layer of old tax returns, a collection of items that made my hands go still. There were receipts, 2 years' worth of restaurant receipts, hotel receipts, receipts for jewelry stores and weekend spa reservations, not from Illinois, from Michigan, Wisconsin. Once, impossibly, from a resort in Sedona, Arizona, during a weekend in March 3 years ago when Daniel had told me he was at a landscaping industry conference in Cincinnati. There were also photographs, printed, physical photographs, which struck me as almost deliberately reckless, as if some part of him had needed to hold the evidence of this other life in his hands. Daniel and Rachel at what appeared to be a winery, Daniel and Rachel on a beach, Daniel and Rachel sitting at a table in a restaurant with the easy, settled intimacy of a couple who had been together long enough to stop performing. 5 years. Here it was in a shoebox. I photographed every single receipt and every photograph with my phone. Then I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, closed the box, and put it back on the shelf in precisely the same position. Then I called Patricia. "I found it," I said. "How much?" she asked. "Enough," I said. "More than enough." I walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the December garden was bare and frozen, hydrangeas cut back to their roots, waiting. Some people look at a dormant garden and see something dead. I had learned, after years of tending it, to see something that was merely biding its time. I had crossed a point I could not uncross, not because I'd done anything irreversible. Everything I had done was measured, legal, documented, but because I now held in my hands what they had spent 5 years making sure I would never find. They should have been more careful with that box. Patricia moved quickly once I brought her the photographs and the receipts. Within a week, she had retained a forensic accountant, a quiet, meticulous man named Gerald Ossie, to examine Daniel's business finances for the period covered by the documentation. The goal was specific: identify any transactions that appeared to be personal expenditures run through the company, particularly those matching dates and locations on the receipts I'd found. I signed the retainer, wrote the check, and felt no hesitation. This was not revenge. This was arithmetic. Gerald's preliminary review took 10 days. What he found confirmed what I had suspected. Over approximately 3 years, Daniel had expensed roughly $23,000 in what appeared to be personal travel, dining, and gifts through the landscaping company. Not extravagant by some standards, extravagant enough. And more importantly, it was documented, traceable, and now in the hands of a professional whose job was to explain it clearly to a judge. Patricia incorporated Gerald's preliminary findings into our settlement demand, which she filed the 3rd week of January. The demand was, by her own description, aggressive but defensible. The house, primary custody of Biscuit, which sounds trivial but wasn't. A settlement reflecting the $23,000 in misappropriated marital adjacent funds, and a clean division of the retirement accounts under a qualified domestic relations order. Daniel's attorney received the demand on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I felt the temperature change. Daniel called me directly, bypassing the attorneys, which Patricia had specifically asked him not to do. I let it ring. He called again. I let it ring again. Then, 20 minutes later, Rachel called. I answered that one. "Megan." Her voice was different from the voicemail. The control was gone, replaced by something tighter. "You need to stop this." I was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter where Daniel had stood the night he told me. I remember thinking how strange it was to be in the same physical space, having such a different conversation. "Stop what, Rachel?" I asked. "You're trying to destroy him. You know what this will do to the business, to his partner? There are employees, Megan, people who didn't do anything to you. It was, I will admit, a competent manipulation. Target the thing that might actually make me hesitate, not Daniel's welfare, which he presumably understood I no longer prioritized, but collateral damage to innocent people. I'm pursuing a fair legal settlement," I said. "If that's uncomfortable for everyone involved, I'd suggest that discomfort has a clear point of origin." "Don't be self-righteous." Her voice sharpened. "You think you're so clean. You think this is simple." "I think you had 5 years to make different choices," I said. "We're past the part where your feelings are my problems." There was a silence. Then, "He has things on you too, you know. Things that won't look great." There it was, the shift from appeal to threat. I had been waiting for it. "Rachel," I said, "I want you to think very carefully about whether you want to have this conversation without attorneys present, and then I want you to think about what things you're referring to and whether, in the context of what I currently have documented, they're really the leverage you think they are. You..." Another silence. Longer this time. "You're being vindictive," she said finally, and her voice had lost its edge, replaced by something that might have been the first genuine emotion she'd shown me in this entire exchange. Frustration. Not guilt. Just frustration at not getting what she wanted. "Goodbye, Rachel," I said, and I hung up. She called back twice. I didn't answer. Daniel texted me 6 times that evening, the messages escalating from reasonable to pleading to. In the final one, something that walked the line of a threat, referencing unspecified things I might want to keep private, which I immediately forwarded to Patricia. Patricia's response when she called me back, "Good, he just made this easier." The next 48 hours were unpleasant. Daniel's attorney sent a letter that attempted to reframe the financial findings as accounting errors and suggested with barely concealed menace that further escalation on our side would prompt a counter-filing challenging my characterization of various assets. It was bluster. Patricia walked me through it with the calm efficiency of someone batting away flies. But bluster still creates noise, and noise is exhausting. By the following weekend, late January, a pale sun on old snow, I had reached a particular kind of tired that wasn't about the legal strategy or the documentation or the tactics. It was deeper than that. It was the tiredness of having to be vigilant in your own life, of having to protect yourself in spaces that were supposed to be safe. I called Diane and asked if I could come over. I drove to her place in Lincoln Park, sat on her couch under a blanket, drank tea, and for the first time since December, allowed myself to be something other than strategic. I cried, finally. The kind of crying that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the physical necessity of releasing pressure that has built past a sustainable point. Diane sat with me and did not try to fix it, which is the most valuable thing a person can do. I stayed 2 nights. I slept deeply both times, which surprised me. On the 3rd morning, I drove home, fed Biscuit, made coffee, and opened my laptop. I felt for the first time genuinely rested. It was a Tuesday morning in early February when Daniel made his first real attempt at seduction. Not the romantic kind, but the kind that's arguably more dangerous. He tried to offer me an easy way out. His attorney sent over what they called a preliminary informal proposal, which Patricia received and forwarded to me with a single line of annotation. "Read this carefully. Tell me what you think. Don't react yet." The proposal was generous on the surface. Daniel offered to let me keep the house outright. No buyout required. He offered a lump sum payment of $30,000. He offered to handle all closing costs if we sold the property instead, giving me the larger share of the equity. In return, he asked that we agree to set aside the financial misconduct findings, characterize the settlement as uncontested, and move the process forward on an accelerated timeline. It was, I recognized immediately, a calculated offer. The house had appreciated significantly. $30,000, while not trivial, was considerably less than what a judge might award if the full picture, the receipts, the photographs, Gerald's report, was placed before the court. What Daniel was really buying with this proposal was the suppression of documentation that could complicate his business, his reputation, and his taxes. Patricia and I met at her office that Thursday. I sat across from her and told her what I thought. "I think it's an admission that they're scared of what we have," I said. She nodded slowly. "It's not a bad offer for someone who wants this over quickly." "I don't want it over quickly," I said. "I want it over correctly." She made a note. "Then we decline. With a counter that makes clear we're not interested in suppressing the financial findings as a condition of settlement." "Yes," I said, "exactly that." Walking back to my car afterward, I noticed that I felt something I hadn't expected. Calm. Not the performed calm I had been deploying in phone calls and legal meetings, but something genuine and quiet underneath it. The offer had been designed to tempt me, to appeal to exhaustion, to the desire to be done, to the part of any person in a prolonged conflict that simply wants it to stop. And it had failed to tempt me. Not because I was made of stone, but because I could see clearly what accepting it would mean. It would mean letting them define the terms of my defeat. The following week, Daniel tried a more personal approach. He came to the house. He still had a key, something Patricia and I were in the process of legally addressing, on a Sunday afternoon when he knew I'd be home. I heard the door and came out of the kitchen to find him standing in the front hallway with Biscuit thrashing around his legs with uncomplicated joy. Because dogs don't know about betrayal. He looked tired. He looked, if I'm being honest, genuinely sad. And I want to be honest about this, because I think the honest version of the story is more useful than the version where I felt nothing. He was my husband for 11 years. I had loved him. Some part of me would probably always register his sadness as information, but registered is not the same as acted upon. "Megan," he said, can we talk? Without the lawyers, just as people?" "We are people," I said. "Who need lawyers?" He looked at me for a long moment. "I know I hurt you. I know there's nothing I can say that makes that different. But this, what you're doing, it's going to cost both of us. The attorneys, the forensic accountant, the timeline. Daniel," I kept my voice even, "you made choices for 5 years. I'm making choices now. That's how this works." He stood there with his hands slightly open at his sides, which is a gesture people make when they're trying to look non-threatening. And I thought about the shoebox in his office closet, and about the receipt from Sedona, and about Rachel's voice saying, "There are things that won't look great." "Please," he said quietly, just that word. I picked up Biscuit and held her against my chest, partly for comfort and partly because it gave me something to do with my hands. "You should go," I said. He went. After the door closed, I stood in my own hallway for a moment and let myself feel all of it. The grief and the anger and the particular exhaustion of being asked to be compassionate towards someone who had spent 5 years treating your compassion as a resource to exploit. And then I set Biscuit down, went to the kitchen, and called Diane. She came over that evening with wine and takeout Thai food, and her friend Carol, who was also recently divorced, amicably but recently, and who turned out to have exactly the combination of dark humor and practical wisdom that the evening required. We sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours. We talked about everything except the settlement, which was a relief, and then we talked about the settlement, which turned out to also be a relief. "You know what you're doing," Carol said at one point, looking at me steadily. "Some people in your situation just react. You're not reacting. That matters. I thought about that after they left. You're not reacting." I had started this process out of survival instinct and had, somewhere along the way, developed something more deliberate, a position, a direction. I went to bed that night thinking about the next step. Rachel had gone quiet. Daniel had backed off. They were watching, regrouping, deciding what to try next. Let them watch. They came together. That's what I hadn't anticipated. Not separately, not through attorneys or intermediaries, but both of them, on a Wednesday evening in the middle of February, ringing my doorbell like people who believed they still had standing to do so. I saw them through the window before I opened the door. Daniel in his coat, shoulders slightly raised against the cold, and Rachel beside him in a gray wool jacket I recognized because I had been with her when she bought it. Nordstrom. 2 years ago, a Saturday in November. She had asked my opinion on the color. I opened the door. Megan. Rachel spoke first, which told me they had discussed strategy. Her voice was calibrated to something approximating warmth. Not the real warmth I had known from her for 30 years, but a careful imitation of it. "We wanted to come in person. Can we just 5 minutes?" Against my better judgment, I let them in. I want to be honest about why, not because I was wavering and not because I believed in their good faith, but because I had learned by then that it was better to know what they were planning than to force them to execute it somewhere I couldn't observe. We sat in the living room. I sat in the armchair. They sat together on the sofa, which confirmed everything about the geometry of the situation. Rachel began, "I know you're angry," she said. "You have every right to be angry. I'm not here to take that away from you." She paused. "But I want you to really think about what you're doing to our family. Mom is devastated. She doesn't know the details, but she knows something is wrong. You and we're sisters, Megan. Whatever happened between me and Daniel, that doesn't have to destroy what we have." I noted the phrase, "whatever happened between me and Daniel." The passive construction, the miniaturization, 5 years of deliberate deception compressed into whatever happened. "What exactly do you think we have?" I asked. She absorbed the question with a slight tightening around the eyes. "We have a history. We have shared family. We have Rachel." I kept my voice steady. "You sat across from me at brunch for 5 years. You let me talk about my marriage. You let me be worried and confused and wonder what was wrong, and you knew the entire time. Every conversation we had was a performance. So when you say we have something, what specifically do you mean?" The warmth in her face flickered. She glanced at Daniel. Daniel leaned forward. "Megan, the financial stuff. We can work that out between us. There's no reason to drag it through court. Make it public record. Think about what that does to both of us professionally. Think about what it does to the business. Marcus, his partner, has a family. His kids didn't do anything. There was Marcus again, the human shield. I had been waiting for him. Daniel," I said, "if you're concerned about Marcus, I'd suggest the two of you have a very honest conversation about what Gerald Ossie found in the business accounts." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's being taken out of context. Gerald Ossie is a CPA with 22 years of experience," I said. "He'll explain his context to the judge." There was a shift in the room. The warmth Rachel had been projecting began to curdle at the edges. She tried once more. The family angle, then the mother angle, then, with transparent desperation, a strange pivot to suggesting that I had never been fully present in the marriage anyway, that Daniel had felt lonely for years, as if this were a mitigation rather than an accusation. I watched her say these things and felt something I can only describe as clarity. "I want you both to hear me clearly," I said when she had finished. "I am not going to withdraw the financial findings. I am not going to accept a settlement that requires me to suppress documentation. I am not going to do that because I'm afraid of this conversation, or because I feel guilty, or because of Marcus's children, who I genuinely wish no harm and who are entirely irrelevant to the legal matter between me and Daniel. We are done." I stood up. Rachel stood too, and the mask slipped entirely cleanly, like something dropping from a height. Her face was suddenly just angry, not wounded, not sorry, just furious. "You're going to regret this," she said. "You think you hold all the cards. You don't know everything." "I know enough," I said, and I walked to the front door and held it open. They left. Daniel didn't say another word. Rachel walked past me without making eye contact, which is what people do when they've run out of moves and don't want you to see that on their faces. After the door closed, I stood alone in my living room for a long moment. Was I scared? Yes. You don't know everything. That had landed. Not because I believed they had something significant, but because uncertainty itself is a weapon, and they had just aimed it at me deliberately. My mind went briefly to dark places. What if there was something? What if I had miscalculated? And then I thought of the shoebox. I thought of Gerald's report. I thought of the printed photographs and the receipt from Sedona, and the 5 years of deliberate, sustained, intimate betrayal. My fear clarified into something useful. It became fuel. I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and wrote a detailed account of the evening's visit. Time, duration, everything said, and emailed it to Patricia. Her response came 20 minutes later. "Good. Document everything. We're almost through the hard part." Almost. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday in late March in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a building in the Loop. Neutral ground, neutral walls, neutral carpet. The deliberately depersonalized environment that family law uses to drain conflict of its drama and reduce everything to line items and signatures. Patricia and I arrived first. We sat on one side of the long table, arranged our files, and waited. Daniel and his attorney arrived 8 minutes later. His attorney was a man named Clifford Parrish. Mid-50s, silver-haired, with the easy confidence of someone who had won more of these than he'd lost. He shook hands with Patricia, without warmth. Daniel sat down across from me and looked at the table. Rachel arrived 5 minutes after that. This was the development Patricia had engineered through a process I only partially understood. Because the business finances were now formally part of the discovery record, and because Rachel had, through an attorney of her own, recently filed a cohabitation notice that effectively confirmed her relationship with Daniel, she'd been compelled to attend as a material witness to certain financial and relational facts at issue. She had a right to have her own counsel present, which she did. A younger woman named Sandra Voss, who looked competent and slightly uncomfortable. So there we were, all of us in one room. The first time since December that I had seen both of them together in a formal setting, which was, of course, the point. The mediator, a retired family court judge named Evelyn Marsh, opened the session with a brief statement about the purpose of the day. Not to determine fault, but to reach a resolution both parties could live with, in lieu of a trial that would cost everyone significantly more time, money, and exposure. I want to describe what I felt sitting in that room. Not triumph. It was too early for triumph. Not fear. I had metabolized that weeks ago. What I felt was something quieter, a kind of settled conviction, the feeling of someone who has prepared carefully and arrived at the right time. Clifford Parrish opened by reiterating Daniel's earlier offer with modest improvements, slightly more in the lump sum, a slight adjustment on the retirement account division. He framed it as generous. He was fluent and polished, and he had, I noticed, a very good poker face. What he didn't have was Gerald Osie's full report, which Patricia had held back, legally, strategically, until this moment. She slid copies across the table at a pause in Clifford's presentation. Evelyn Marsh received one. Daniel received one. Clifford Parrish received one. The report was 41 pages, clearly indexed, with transaction records, comparative analysis, and a summary that made its conclusions impossible to misread. Clifford Parrish read the summary page. His poker face survived, just barely. Daniel looked at the cover page and then looked up at me for the first time since we'd sat down. I held his gaze with an effort that cost me almost nothing, because I had been rehearsing this moment for 3 months. Then Evelyn Marsh began asking questions. She was methodical. She asked about specific transactions. She asked Clifford to address Gerald's findings point by point. Clifford demurred, redirected, referenced the need for further review. Standard tactics, well executed. What he couldn't do was make the numbers not say what they said. And then Rachel made her mistake. She'd been quiet for the first 90 minutes. Sandra Voss had, I suspected, specifically instructed her to say as little as possible. But when Evelyn Marsh asked a specific question about a trip to Sedona in March 3 years ago, cross-referencing Daniel's business expense records with his personal calendar, Rachel, without consulting Sandra, said, "That was a work trip. He was there for client meetings." Evelyn Marsh looked at her over her reading glasses. "Miss Calloway," she said, using my maiden name, which Rachel still shared, which was its own small irony. "Are you personally familiar with the details of that trip?" Rachel realized, a second too late, what she had just done. Sandra Voss had gone very still beside her. No, Rachel said. "I mean, he mentioned it at the time. You were aware of the trip when it occurred. We talked." She was backpedaling and the room could hear it. "Were you present on that trip?" A pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds too long. No. Evelyn Marsh made a note. Clifford Parrish had stopped making eye contact with his client. I hadn't said a word. Patricia had. She placed in front of Evelyn Marsh a single photograph, not from Daniel's shoebox, but a print extracted from Rachel's own Instagram account, archived before the account was made private in January, geotagged at a resort in Sedona, Arizona, dated March 14th, 3 years ago. Rachel in sunglasses, squinting against the desert sun, a second person's arm visible at the edge of the frame, in a gray Henley I recognized as Daniel's because I had bought it for his birthday. The photograph had been taken by the account holder. Rachel had taken it of herself. She had posted it publicly. She had tagged the location. She had simply assumed 3 years ago that no one would ever need to find it. The room was very quiet. "I'd like to take a short break," Clifford Parrish said. Evelyn Marsh agreed. During the break, Patricia and I went to the corridor. She poured water from a thermos, handed me a cup, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "How are you feeling?" "Ready," I said. She nodded. "Good. Because when we go back in, they're going to settle." They settled. Not gracefully. Not on their terms. They settled the way people settle when they've run out of positions to hold. Like a retreat through a house that's already on fire. Clifford Parrish spent 20 minutes with Daniel during the break. Sandra Voss spent the same 20 minutes with Rachel. When we reconvened, Clifford opened with the phrase Patricia had told me months earlier was the surest signal of defeat. "My client is prepared to discuss a comprehensive resolution." Not an offer, a resolution. The language of surrender dressed as pragmatism. The house, mine. Full title transferred. No buyout. Daniel had 45 days to remove his belongings. The locks were changing at day 46. The joint savings, split equitably, adjusted for the $23,400 in documented misappropriated funds, added directly to my settlement share. The retirement accounts, divided under a qualified domestic relations order, with my share reflecting both the statutory marital portion and an offset for the concealed financial activity. Daniel's business. I released any direct claim in exchange for a structured payment representing my personal guarantee on the original loan. Clifford Parrish didn't contest the figure, which told me he'd done the same math. Biscuit. Mine. Daniel's attorney raised it once. Patricia looked at him. He moved on. Legal fees. Daniel was responsible for a substantial contribution to my legal and forensic accounting costs, justified in Evelyn Marsh's summary note as the documented pattern of financial misconduct that necessitated expert review. Daniel signed. Page by page, across the table from me, he signed. I watched him do it and felt not joy. This was not a joyful moment, but the sober satisfaction of a person who has done what they said they would do. Rachel was present for the parts involving the cohabitation disclosure. When Sandra Voss indicated she had nothing further to contribute, Rachel stood to leave. She was 3 feet from the door when she stopped and turned back. She looked at me directly for the first time all day. I thought she was going to say something, a threat, a final attempt at the last word. Instead, she stood there with the expression she made when she was trying not to cry and didn't want anyone to know it. Then she left. Patricia gathered her files with unhurried precision. The formal paperwork will take 4 to 6 weeks, but the material terms are binding from today. "I know," I said. "You did well," she said. "Most people in your position either collapse early or overcorrect. You didn't do either." I walked out into a March afternoon, cold and bright in the specific way of Chicago Springs, the kind of day that surprises you with its bite the moment you step outside. I stood on the sidewalk and let the wind hit me. Then I called Diane. "It's over," I said. "How are you?" "I'll tell you over dinner," I said. "I'll book somewhere good," she said. I walked to my car, my house waiting at the other end of the drive, my garden already starting, quietly underneath the frozen soil, to come back. The hydrangeas came back in June. They always did, but that year I noticed it differently. I stood on the porch with my coffee longer than was probably reasonable, just looking. The house felt quieter. More specifically, mine. I'd repainted the spare bedroom, rearranged the kitchen, made the small adjustments that accumulate into a life that fits. At work, I'd taken on a new position, managing a team of 8, a salary that let me think about building rather than protecting. Diane and I started a standing Thursday dinner with Carol and a new friend named Priya, a structural engineer with a laugh that made rooms louder. She introduced me to hiking. Biscuit claimed the armchair in my reading nook. By fall, there was also Stephen, a civil engineer, and I didn't know where it was going. And that felt easy in a way it hadn't for a long time. Rachel and Daniel moved in together after the settlement. It didn't hold. The things that had made the affair thrilling didn't survive becoming ordinary. By fall, they were no longer living together. Daniel's partner bought him out in September. Rachel was in a studio in Rogers Park. Consequence is morally neutral. It simply arrives. My mother came for Thanksgiving and told me she was proud of me. Priya, Diane, and Carol came for dinner. Stephen came for dessert. It was loud and improbable, and I had done nothing to plan it except buy the turkey. Standing at the sink at 10 o'clock, I thought about the December night when I'd sat alone at this same table and typed 3 words. I have proof. What I'd really meant was, I see you, and I'm starting to move. I had moved, and I hadn't stopped since. If there's a lesson in what I lived through, it's this. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who is counting on your passivity is to become precise. I didn't fight with rage. I didn't fall apart in ways they could use. I got quiet, I got organized, and I let the truth be loud on my behalf. No one owes you your own life back. You have to reclaim it, document it, and refuse to trade it for the comfort of making things easy on the people who took it from you. I want to be honest about one more thing. There were nights when I almost let it go. When the offer on the table felt like enough, when the exhaustion felt like wisdom, when a small voice said, just be done with it. And in those moments, I thought of that shoebox. I thought of the receipt from Sedona. I thought of Rachel's face at every brunch where she looked me in the eye and said nothing. That was enough to keep me moving. Don't let anyone make you feel that protecting yourself is cruelty. It isn't. It's clarity. What would you have done? Would you have taken the easy settlement? Would you have let the shoebox stay on the shelf? I'd love to know. Leave a comment. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe. There are more. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.